Welcome to Prevention Leaders Podcast with Dave Closson, your source for insights into the world of substance misuse prevention. Each episode, Dave brings you the latest strategies, expert discussions, and real-life success stories designed to empower your work and inspire impactful change. Whether you're a prevention professional, community advocate, or simply passionate about making a difference, this podcast will keep you informed and motivated. Get ready to lead with a confidence that drives lasting results. Let's lead the change together.
All right, podcast listeners and watchers, y'all, I hope you are seated and ready for just an incredible conversation that has taken us a few years to actually make happen because we've been busy working alongside each other. But finally, the one and only Ben Tanzer, welcome.
Dude, honored to be here. I know. When did we start that conversation? In high school? But of course, Now the technology's caught up with us so we can do this properly.
Right? Exactly. But no, it's been probably 3 years since we first connected and started to work together. A little background for the listeners here. Ben and I connected through the Montana Institute, doing a lot of work with them. Ben's a trainer with them. I do a lot of the video virtual work for them, and also I'm on site for the Summer Institute, which y'all need to come to it next year in 2025. Really do. It is an experience. Yeah. So that's just a very quick background on how we got connected. Can you tell us a little bit about you? Like, I've heard your story, elements of it, how you found your way to prevention is just so intriguing to me. So could you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be honored. And again, thanks for having me here. It did take us a minute, but it is very exciting. And as a fellow podcaster, I tend to geek out about this stuff regardless. I was very drawn to doing child welfare work. And I was in New York City. This goes back about 25 years. I know I look much younger, but I was a caseworker. And, now that I'm so old, I'm always thinking, man, I hope I did a good job because they don't train you. They just throw you in. I was actually talking about this with someone the other day, but I was very drawn to the work because I was very drawn to how do you support children and families? Like that was always a bent of mine. I grew up in a home that was social justice driven, activism driven, anti anything that involved oppression or keeping people down or institutions that weren't doing the job, at least from my parents' perspective. So, I'm pretty left. I hope that doesn't put off too many of your listeners. And then my parents were like, whatever left of left is, I don't know what's left of Bernie Sanders, but it was a real enriching environment to grow up in, especially being also the son of a therapist. So my mom trained in psychoanalysis. So we were never allowed to just say, oh, I just had that dream. It always was, well, what was going on in that dream?
Tell me more.
Why? Tell me more. I don't think that's the answer. And you could never say because that was off the table. And then my father was an artist and they both were from New York City. He didn't ask for all this background, but it's interesting. My mom was from New York, grew up in Baltimore. Her father was a veteran and a community organizer. His father was a union organizer at turn of the century New York City, 1900. My father's a high school dropout. His parents owned a candy store. So it was a very interesting mix of mid-century New York City people, a mix of intellectual and art and all activists, all the time. And so I always had that in my head. I don't think I thought of the work as activism as much as I thought of what do people need? How do you get it to them? How do you meet them where they're at? I don't think I had all that language, right? But what really brought me to prevention was I was endlessly struck, which is a poor choice of words, I'm aware, but I was endlessly brought to my attention that people didn't seem to ever bring the children or their families into the rooms where the decisions were being made. One thing in particular, it always stuck with me, and I actually got to an argument with someone, which I used to not do, actually do a lot more now. But there had been a kid I was working with who got shot, and the hospital was making all these decisions and not including him or his foster mother or me. And I'm third on that priority list, but I went to the doctor in charge, who was awesome, but also a doctor in a big New York City hospital. And I said, how is this happening? Like, you're not going to bring them into the conversation. You're not going to talk planning with them, community supports. And I remember she said something like, oh, you're one of those types. I didn't even ask her to define that. But I started asking, how do you get in the room? What does it take to get in the room? And some of that's ego. I don't want to, minimize my own ego. As I started to learn what I could learn, it sort of drifted towards prevention. It seemed like if you got invited to meetings about prevention, you might be in the room where people actually wrote plans and thought about policy. I don't even know if I knew what policy was back then. I was barely older than my older son is now, but I just kept pushing and pushing. I went to grad school. I don't even think I was drawn to prevention, as I said to you offline, because you could prevent something before it occurred, which of course now blows my mind. I just thought those people, whoever those people are, decision makers, were the prevention people. And that's what I was interested in, getting in the room and trying to work with people and trying to influence their decisions. And always, again, on behalf particularly of children and families. So in those years, I also worked in the field of HIV/AIDS. I worked with now we use the phrase unhoused. So the unhoused of serious mental illness. So I was sort of hopscotching around, if that's the right phrase, like wherever the work was and wherever grad school let me go. And, prevention's still a big part of all of that work, right? I mean, how do we prevent diseases from being transmitted? And how do we support people? How do we prevent people from ending up on the street and not in housing? And of course, how do we prevent child abuse and neglect, sexual abuse? Ultimately, that was the work I wanted to sort of be around and understand. So I don't know if that was the answer you were looking for, but that's how my brain was operating 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And so it kind of led you to preventing child abuse and neglect. But then you took kind of at least from my perspective, took another step into the prevention world following your time with Prevent Child Abuse America. That brought you to the Montana Institute.
Yeah, so this is actually a really good story. And I know you've already mentioned them. They're colleagues of ours. I'm, what's the word? There's some word I want to use that doesn't sound culty, but, as soon as I learned about their work, like a lot of people, I thought, this is the work. I mean, more literally, I used to be honored. I had the honor to manage a really big CDC grant, Centers for Disease Control grant, for and with Prevent Child Abuse America. I was the liaison. I wrote the grants. I went to some big meeting in Atlanta, lowest on the depth chart and sitting in my corner doing my thing. And they brought in Dr. Linkenbach, Jeff Linkenbach, who we both work with. And, one cool thing about the CDC, which I always loved, because I aspire to being an intellectual, I just keep falling short, is they would bring you in for these big planning meetings. But if there was somebody really smart that they loved, they would just bring them in, whether they fit the discussion going on or not. Like if the person was smart and interesting, that was worth taking time for. And then you'd see people from other divisions and departments come in just to listen. That's a really cool, for me, atmosphere to be around. Anyway, Dr. Linkenbach, Jeff came in. He was talking about positive community norms, marketing and communications. By that time, I was doing strategic communications, and we had done some really interesting work, which I would love to talk more about. We had worked with the Frameworks Institute in Washington, D.C. about how to reframe the communications and language around prevention. And so then Jeff came in talking about the PCN work. And I don't want to literally say a light bulb went off, but I thought, oh, that's the missing thing. Like that's one of the things we need to incorporate in our work, which I thought was going really well. I mean, I take very little credit for this. Anyone from Prevent Child Abuse America listening, there is no question in my mind that us and our chapters and the Healthy Family America sites and our other partners, we changed messaging in this country around prevention. And I am really proud to have been anywhere around that. But I also thought Jeff's work, and we'll come back to this, I hope, particularly on misperceptions, was the piece we were missing. So he actually approached me and wanted to learn more about our work. And then I lost my mind a bit after talking to him. We went on a run the next morning. I'm always running in the morning. And we talked about the work. And I called my boss and I was like, look, man, I don't know what this Montana Institute is. I don't know who this guy, Jeff Linkenbach, is, but they're the missing link. And it was really cool. My boss didn't always do this. And give a small shout out to Jim Morovich, who I have a lot of affection for, but he said, if you think it's that important, get him to the next national conference. Like, we'll make him a speaker. And that started this relationship. And then I did not want to let go of the Montana Institute, and they did not want to let go of me. And it used to be sort of lower level, but as I left Prevent Child Abuse America, or politely, as they asked me to leave, and I started finding my way, I realized that A, I loved communications, but B, I'd always loved the training and workshop and presenting part, sort of and now I realize it's much more of my why than I realized then. And that, yes, I believe I'm good at marketing, competent in strategic communications, but it is that element of working with people hands-on, designing those workshops. And it took me a year or two to sort of come to that. And then I circled back to the Montana Institute, who I was doing some work with. This is maybe 5 years ago. And I said, can we do more? Can I do more? I have an idea for you, which is the other thing. That was my big aha. Bring them an idea. Don't count on the Montana Institute to throw work at you. So I brought them a transformational leadership workshop idea. They said, develop it. And now for the last 3 to 5 years, we've been very involved. And, man, I get to meet people like you, travel. It's a thrill. It really is a thrill. I can't really speak highly enough of this stage of my professional life.
Big light bulb moments, almost like bells ringing. Da-da-da. This is it. I kind of had a similar experience actually with when I first met Jeff and really got to learn about the power of the positive. And for me, it's tied to my own personal recovery, my own journey in that. And I talk about this in a lot of my veteran presentations. Like I'd been struggling with my traumatic brain injury, my PTSD, anxiety, depression, and addiction, the darkness. And all I ever saw around me messaging wise was problem focused. That didn't make me feel any kind of hope.
Right.
Or it's like, oh, yeah, okay, that's normal. No, it's normal. Yep. No shit. That's normal. Okay. I'm just same old. But then when I had my own sort of light bulb moment, transformational moment where I really started to turn the corner, what helped me was focusing on the positive, was finding the natural strengths I had within. What helped me be a good soldier, what helped me be a good athlete in high school. And how can I leverage those, lean on those positive strengths to be the man I want to be? Like the positive was what helped me find sobriety. And so then it just like clicked for me in that sense. And I'm getting goosebumps right now because it's that powerful, man.
So, it's interesting. First off, I love that. And, I admire you anyway. And I'm always excited to hear you talk about yourself in that way. I don't have good language I'm about to say. I always leaned positive and not from a place of darkness. I don't believe that I've had my own stuff, nothing on the level you're talking about, but my brain always went to how do we, and now I'm going to use TMI language to Montana, which I don't intend to, but I was always about uncovering the positive in relationships. And I think it's sort of a peacekeeper vibe. Like, let's figure out what's good here because the negative shit, excuse my language. I told you I wasn't going to swear. That's my one swear word, but the negative stuff can be so overwhelming. So my inclination was always to say, yeah, that's terrible. Right. And look at this. It's funny. A lot of people push back on that. And, one of the beauties of the Montana Institute is they're like, let them push back. That means you're reaching them. So what's interesting is that their structure, their frameworks, their science, actually, in a way, what's the phrase? Sort of not validated. I want to use a better word, but it began to underline things I already believe. And I think what's interesting is, you bring these two, not polar opposites, these two pieces together. I try to be a positive person, period. I didn't have any training. I wasn't suffering. It was just an inclination. But as I got into, and I hope we'll dig into this more, as I got into the communications element of our work, I thought, you have to focus on the positive, and not the rah, toxic positive. I mean, how do you uncover positive things and the importance of utilizing that in communications to the point you already made? If someone's suffering, we know the fear-based communications don't work. They don't help. I mean, I really hope we'll dive into all that. So I love that you found that. That's who I was. And then you find out that there's science and structure and, again, frameworks to sort of give it shape. I mean, then it feels like anything's possible, right?
So you're naturally seeking the positive even before meeting Jeff.
Yes.
I would be curious, and this might be for, offline, but let's talk about your mother and how that might have influenced.
No, we should talk about my mother. My mother does not get enough credit. So I think what's interesting about her, and I love giving her a shout out because this actually came up on an interview I was doing on my podcast, not intended as a plug. My dad was a big personality. not, I'm trying to think of the right word. He was a big person. He was an artist. He had a big ego. I mean, he was very, as I said, loving. He was an activist. He had all these things going on. And he just took up space, even though he's only like my size. So my mom doesn't always get enough, not credit, doesn't get enough attention in the story. I don't consider her relentlessly positive, which I think is interesting. But what she always said was, what's the next layer? Right? And so I think one of the ways I have interpreted that and internalized it is to say, the next layer means, I'm going to use again TMI language, that there's hope there, right? It's not all negative. When you're upset, when you've got a scary dream, when you're feeling stressed, when you're hitting some of the darkness you were talking about a moment ago, which, by the way, man, I think it's very brave the way you share. And I hope that doesn't get lost in these conversations. It gets minimized how brave that stuff is, I think. But, she always pushed us. Why? For me, I guess one of the ways I took that in was, well, where's the positive? I have this story, which I'll share with you. It's very self-aggrandizing, but it's funny. There was a kid I worked with years ago when I was a child welfare worker, and his mother, I never met his mother, his bio mother. I never met her because she was struggling with addiction. And I'm smiling because there's a good outcome, but they didn't even know where she was. So I get a call one day and they say, yo, so-and-so's mom is in the hospital. They found her in Central Park. She was living in the park and she'd had a heart attack. And I go in to meet her and, people always described her. And this is really important to get around our communication. They described her as this monster. And I go in and she's just, a mom lying in a bed. I know it's way more complicated. She's in bed. And she goes, oh, so you're Ben. My kids have been talking about you. And I said, hey, you're so-and-so. I don't want to use anyone's names. I go, it's really nice to meet you. And then she said, and look how you're meeting me. I had a heart attack in Central Park and now I'm in the hospital. And then I said, well, at least you bottomed out. You can't go any lower than this, right? It's the first time I ever met her. And she started laughing really hard and was sober, as far as I know, for the rest of her life and still is. And for years would drop me a note and remind me I'd made that comment. And I'm not saying I did it. I know I didn't do anything, right? She did something, but I wanted to find the positive for her because that was a pretty scary situation. And it was funny because like a week later, I was in family court. They wanted to terminate her parental rights. And I said, I've only known her for a week. There's a whole file here. I said, but the person I've met, I think she's on the road to recovery. I think she deserves a shot. Can we postpone this or whatever the right language is? And, they did. She became the mom she wanted to be and her kids got the mom they needed. And that was after years of her not being that mom. And again, none of it has to do with me saying something positive, but I remember the moment I thought, think of something funny, think of something positive. This is not the moment to be dire or dour and be like, you had a heart attack. I mean, who benefits from that, right?
Oh, there's so many different thoughts coming to mind right now.
Sure, that was way too much story. Apologies.
Oh, no. First, folks watching may have noticed my reaction when you said, at least you've hit rock bottom, because I don't know. I could have said that. But then you and your personality and your style and who you are as an individual, you can communicate differently than I can. If we said the exact same thing verbatim, different outcomes, different impacts, different effects. And so I think I want to kind of go down that line and talk more about communication as a whole. You worked with strategic communication. And I think that's a topic we need to unpack for our listeners, because one of the things that I've seen in the prevention field is often when it comes to marketing communications, that just gets delegated to the youngest person on the team, whether they have any background, experience, training with that. It's just pass it off to the younger person. They get this, they know. But there's a whole lot of strategy that comes to that. And since I've been working with Muse Street Marketing for my business, I've learned all about brand strategy, framework, content pillars, like a whole bunch of stuff. How can you be strategic about this? Yeah. Tell me about that. Not really a question there other than tell me about it.
Let me see if I can sound intelligent. So it's interesting. I'm giving you all the stuff. So another piece of me as a person and as a child and someone who became an adult, whatever is that, I always always have. And again, always means not always, right? But throughout my life, I've been very conscious of picking the right words. So even before I knew that was a thing, before I understood that as a frame, before I understood, I always thought you need to pick your words because it was very clear to me on some level, even as a young person, that people responded to the words you chose. So sometimes, especially when I was younger, much less now, I might be provocative, but I was always conscious of it, which also means I've made mistakes like everybody, and I don't always communicate. I remember one time, my wife probably won't listen to this. We got into a polite thing. And then she said, it must be killing you that you can't think of the right word that's going to help me get to where you want me to get to. I was like, you know me a little too well. She was so right. I was like, how am I not framing this better? And whatever it was so minor. I can't even remember what it was, but she had me to write. So I'm sharing that because it's important. I always cared about pick the right word. And I don't mean, I know this is obvious. I don't mean like, what's the 10-cent word versus the 5-cent word, or what's the word that's not jargony. I mean, understanding what people are going to respond to and be put off by. I was always conscious of that. So like with that mom, I could tell that we had a vibe, and I could be like slightly funny, but also in my mind, be very clear. This needs to be rock bottom, right? You're dead after this. Like the next time I see you, you're dead. So what's going to happen next? And I'm very much also about what's going to happen next. Like, how do we put this into action? And that's an important part of communication. So then I'm going to back up. Communications that don't lead to action are not necessarily effective. So one of the things we need to think about is what's going to make someone pause and think, I want to be part of your cause. I want to get involved in policy work. I want to lean in and not run away. So this gets to your personal example. And this gets to a Montana Institute thing. And I wrote some notes ahead of time because I knew we'd talk about this. So it seems very organic, even better. We need to promote health, not fear, right? So the Montana Institute is very focused on, if you want health, promote health. I'm just quoting them. But my work in prevention all those years ago, when we were involved in the research, and of course, I'm no scientist. I'm sure that's clear already. As one of my friends once said, you're like a street PhD. Like you sound smart, but you don't actually use smart words. I guess that's the best I can do being from New York. But, when we did the reframing work we did, what became clear is that much of the field had been built on trying to scare people into caring. And what they said to us was, you accomplished one part of your job. You raised awareness. Let's not minimize that, right? Again, picking the right words, being positive. The positive is, took an issue that no one thought or cared about, child abuse and neglect, and you made people recognize it was an important thing. What you haven't done is prompted people to want to take action on behalf of the cause. That's the next step. And you're going to have to use different language. And they don't use the word positive, right? Sorry, I don't know why I did that air quote there. But what they're saying is, how are you going to tell the story of innovation? How are you going to tell a story about transformation? How are you going to pick words that says, look, we believe in building kids' brains, right? We believe in really cool, innovative programming. And why do we believe in it? Or how do we implement it? Because we know that child abuse and neglect undermines development. So in the old days, and this is like the old days, you came out swinging, right? This is a pandemic. Child abuse and neglect's a pandemic. It's terrifying. It's this, it's that. The numbers are this and that. Human brains don't want that information. They are not going to take action. We were shutting people down. So we had to start reframing the message. We had to start saying, look, there's all this possibility here. That doesn't mean we're running from child abuse and neglect. That doesn't mean it's not happening. But let's talk about the promise of home visiting, right? Let's talk about the different work people are doing in Milwaukee and North Carolina. I could be making that up, but I'm not making that up, right? People are doing that work. Let's talk about the interesting programming that are elevating children and their families. Let's have that discussion. And I promise you, we'll still talk about child abuse. We will get to the numbers. So you start to flip the message. And one thing that drew me to TMI, Montana Institute, and this goes into research Jeff did. And that, by the way, everything you and I are talking about, my other long-going obsession, even though, again, I'm not that smart myself, is that I believe in data. and I believe in science, and I've always believed in data and science. And so our early communications work, like in the prevention field, didn't always look to science. And later we did. And for me, that just made sense, even though I could never do that myself, but I can translate it and I can write it. I'm sharing that because one of the things Jeff's research showed was that misperceptions are themselves a risk factor, right? So it's really important to understand you, Dave, me, Ben, we may know the truth. We may know what's correct, but if someone's perception is at odds with what we know, they're not letting go of that perception very easily, right? Our job is to tell them a story that allows them to step away from that. So a great example of this, which I bring up all the time, is stranger danger. So I'm both old enough and young enough that my kids were still getting saturated with stranger danger messages. Stranger danger is built on the idea, right, that someone's grabbing your kids off the street and running away. And that happens. I don't want to minimize it. That happens. But what we learned was that 90% of sexual abuse cases, for example, were the strangers you know, not actual strangers, right? Coaches, neighbors, on and on and on. And so that's a very strong misperception, stranger danger. And part of our work was to say, it's the stranger you know. We need to tell a different story, right? And we need to tell a story that goes and directs it at the misperception you're holding on to, because that gets in the way. And what we also learned is that when people believe their kids can get snatched off the street, which again, man, I don't want to minimize that. I was once doing a workshop and a woman raised her hand and she said, look, my kid was snatched off the street by a stranger. And I said, I really hope I have not said anything to offend you. I'm talking about the data and I'm talking about messaging, but it would make me sick if I did anything to offend you. And then she said, and it was wild because she said, no. I'm here because I know my kid's the exception, not because I'm here to tell you they're the exception. And it was very painful because it is painful, because it's all painful, another part of this discussion. But again, pushing back politely, right, on those misperceptions, telling a different story, getting people out of the frames in their head. It's crucial because when I cut my own self off, when people believe those kinds of misperceptions, they feel less safe in their neighborhood. And when they feel less safe, then they're less likely to embrace the programming and innovative stuff you hope to do with them. I mean, that just plays itself out again and again. And so this translates to all the prevention work we do. I mean, look at some of those meth campaigns, which are now famous because they're so terrifying, but they also didn't work. I mean, this is really important stuff. I'm not going to say it like I want to say it. I'm not trying to be self-deprecating, but there's so much work that's been done that, in fact, doesn't help us, right? Those horrific meth campaigns, I think a lot of them were in Montana, with all due respect to the great state of Montana, that doesn't prevent people from smoking meth. If anything, sometimes it celebrates it. So we have to be careful with those scary messages. What's that campaign? Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. I used to be able to pull it up so quickly. I know police forces. I know you're a former police guy. They used it all over the country. Was it DARE?
The DARE program, Click It or Ticket.
Click It and Ticket was very successful. That was a very well done messaging. That's from North Carolina. Very effective. But DARE, if I'm not mistaken, they've never found any evidence to support it, or just say no. So what's fascinating is money keeps going into that kind of thing. It continually fails, but there's a perception that it's working. That perception,
the drunk goggles, the mock car crashes, there's all
Dude, don't get me started on that.
That's a whole rant.
I hope all of your listeners are like, oh my gosh, not the car in front of the high school. But it's important, right? Because those things get funded. So it takes money away from stuff that we know works, but it also scares people, so they're less likely to be engaged. And it extends a narrative that then we have to work that much harder to get around. It's like a lot. And again, I want to be careful because none of my comments are political. They're all data driven. It's like a lot of the abstinence only campaigns. I'm pro abstinence if that's your choice, but a campaign around sexual development and activity that's only driven by abstinence, we know those fail, but we keep funding them. So that's what I also got very caught up in, right? Which was, and I'm going to use a word you used earlier, which we use at the Montana Institutes. What's actually effective? Not what do you like, Not what can you get funded? Is it effective? Are we changing or transforming communities and numbers? I mean, that's what kept me focused and interested in strategic. And that's the strategic part. I'm not sure I write a great press release. I hope I do. However, I do know how to take numbers and tell a story with them. That's the strategic part, right? That's where you get thoughtful. That's where you start thinking, what's the right image, right? That's another thing we talk about scare campaigns. It's so tempting to put up some horrific picture, like you mentioned, the car crash. But what about putting up a picture of healthy families and children and people thriving and saying, look, this is what we're focused on. This is our hope. And then we know that child abuse or meth or whatever it is, it undermines all of those possibilities. That's a different narrative.
Yeah. And talking strategic communication, I'll say as far as just in moving folks towards action for those health outcomes, but then you also had, you just went right off your tongue, but talking about the importance of strategic communication as it relates to community engagement and building trust and being able to even have conversations with your focused populations as well. Like,
absolutely.
Powerful, important part too, right?
So it was interesting. Many, many years ago, I was a much younger person, though still very old. I was doing a workshop around this, and someone in the room said, "Oh, so you're telling us how to work with our clients. That's what you're doing. You're telling me how to talk to my client." And they were pushy, but not like they were contorted. They were trying to figure it out. Like, I have all this training. Are you telling me that I don't know how to do therapy or something like that? And I had never had that question. So I paused, try to get my act together. But then I had one of those aha moments. And it's not profound. I was like, no, I'm glad you asked the question the way you asked it, because that's 180 of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is your programming, your technique, your training is exceptional. We know that. The data reflects it. But the community doesn't know it, because what you haven't done yet is wrapped a story around your work that they want to listen to. So what I'm saying to you is no, don't do your work differently. Talk about your work differently, right? And I always say this to people, you're all champions of these messages. If you're involved in this work at all, the community, even if they don't know it, they're counting on you. So you could be at Little League practice, dance rehearsal. You could be at church or temple, your mosque. You could be on the pickup line at school. Someone is at some point going to say something, and you have an opportunity to tell the reframed version of that story. So, it was interesting when this person was like, "You're telling me how to do my job," which, people always get worked up about that. I thought, no, I want you to talk about your job better. I want you to be more effective. So next time you send out a letter, a fundraising letter, or you write an op-ed and people say, "Oh, I want to be part of that. I want to highlight that. I'm going to post that to my Facebook page because it's important."
Squirrel moment in that you just described a podcast Steve Miller and I are trying to figure out how to make come to life, in that making prevention a dinner table conversation. When you're on the sidelines at the Little League game, you're going to turn to your friend sitting next to you, your parent sitting next to you, and actually talk about prevention. That's a dream and goal of ours. And I'm lost in that thought right now, so I'll just come right back.
I'll pull you back. But that's a great thing, right? Because, what you're talking about too, and we used to try to do this on the job, is think about all the scenarios and then what are the talking points you'd like people to have, right? How would you like to tell that story? What can you say in language that's simple and straightforward, right? How do we do that? How do we say, well, actually, I'd like to offer you a different version of what you're thinking, right? Like maybe you haven't thought through that yet. Or, so yes, that would be a great podcast. It would be a great short podcast too, right? Like, now I'm doing your work. I apologize.
Yep, 5, 10 minute. Yep.
That's what I'm thinking. 5 or 10 minute episodes, you guys going over what the not proper, right? What the effective language is. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with people casually, and, they say something, they think they're being funny. And then you have that moment where you have to think, well, I never play along with those moments. It is not my greatest trait. But you also have to think, do I want to reframe it in a way that they're going to pause and think about what they're saying, right? And we can all take on that responsibility to some extent. We can all take on responsibility of, hey, I'm not sure you know what you're talking about. Can I send you a link? Can I direct you to this website? And if you work at a place like Prevent Child Abuse America or anywhere around it or any of their partners, there's a ton of resources out there. I think one of the things that gets lost and we don't always all do a good job with is getting people to the proper resources. So the early days of the internet, I am that old, Dave. One of my obsessions was ensuring that at least Prevent Child Abuse America was near the top of the Google page, right? So that when you Googled anything around prevention, you got to us first. And my thinking at the time, and this is also strategic, was look, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Our job is to correct it for sure. But one of the ways we correct that is that they find us and not someone else, right? Like you just preempt it completely. You're not going to get all that stuff off the internet, but you can dominate the internet. And that's why early days, and again, this was a great collective effort many years ago. How could we be blogging and on Twitter and on Facebook? I remember the first time we brought Facebook to a meeting, people were screaming at us, that's for college students. And I will admit, I wish I was more brilliant because I would love to be so brilliant. Keep not pulling that off. But I remember thinking, this is going to be a great communications tool. It's not just for college students. And, I am happy to say of the many, many things I've been wrong about, I was correct about that one. Like everyone's on Facebook now. 15 years ago, that was an odd conversation to have. But I thought, if you're going to put your message out there, you got to put it wherever people are going to go.
Yeah.
Not gonna. My mom would kill me. Anywhere you're going to go. Going to, Dave.
Random Facebook story, because it's my podcast and I can talk about myself.
Yes, you can.
I was deployed in November 2004. So went and got trained up, and then I was on the advanced party. So I went early. So I got trained. So then I could train the rest of the guys. Spent 2005 in country, got back May of 2006. And all of a sudden there's this Facebook thing.
Right.
It just boomed that whole year and a half, 18 months that I was gone. I came back and I had no idea what it was. So behind. Yeah. Anyways, that was my random Facebook story. But talking about the work we do in prevention, talking about it differently, wrapping the story around the work we do as a professional storyteller, writer, and podcaster, what tips, what wisdom can you share with our listeners on how to go about doing that?
Couple of things. And again, you could turn a whole podcast into this. You will probably exceed my expertise regardless, but you really do need to start with the data. And I hope somewhere Sarah is listening to this from the Montana Institute and she's like, yes, you do. The data is, but this is really important, right? Understanding what the data tells you. What is the data saying about the work you're interested in? What is it saying about the issues you're interested in? It's very easy to skip the science phase. So if I can do a Montana Institute thing, right? We have spirit, science, action begets return. I didn't say that as well as I could have, but that's a cycle of transformation. So the spirit part, we can kind of skip. Sometimes we even skip the science part. A lot of us are really good with the action part. I consider myself great with the action part. But the science part is crucial, right? Gathering information. So part of that's being patient. So it's a funny thing to say, hey, pick up the pace and slow down. But you have to understand what you're talking about. You have to understand what's going on in your community, what's going on. Because people, again, perceptions, people can tell you what they think is going on. I've told this story a number of times recently. There's a whole universe, I live in Chicago now, that wants to believe Chicago's on fire and it's like the Wild West. And I really want to acknowledge, it's very important, right? There are neighborhoods that the city has neglected, where there's more violence, where there are more guns. Again, not a political statement, reality. There are neighborhoods that are dangerous, like in lots of big cities, though violent crime in Chicago and across the nation has dropped significantly. It's important to put that out there because, again, numbers, but I don't live in one of those neighborhoods. And I want to stress, I know how privileged that is. So I'm putting that on the table too, but I went to a safety meeting. I've told this story a couple of times, but I went to a safety meeting with people in my neighborhood. My wife asked me to go. She was out of town. She's like, just find out what they're talking about. And, it's about perceptions. People were very upset. They were very upset about the shootings in our neighborhood, about the violence. And they were, I wouldn't say they were articulate, right? I don't want to give them too much credit, but they were impassioned. And I appreciate that. It's fear, right? It's coming from a place of fear. And the guy they sent, the sergeant, this guy could have trained at the Montana Institute. He sat there. He said, I hear you. I see you. Like, he didn't say it quite like that. And he looked like any Chicago cop you can imagine. I say that with a smile, but he's like, look, I hear you and I understand you're scared. And that's why we're here today. He said, I do want to point something out. The data doesn't support anything you're talking. Those shootings are not happening in your neighborhood. Those robberies are not happening. He goes, I will tell you what's happening because there's a huge stretch of bars in our neighborhood. He said, people are walking home at 4:00 in the morning and they're drunk and they're staring at their phone and they're getting robbed. He goes, that's happening all the time. These other things, it's not just that we don't have the data to support it. We don't even get those phone calls. So he goes, I understand that's how it feels. He goes, I understand. And he goes, but it's not what's happening. So when you talk about this is part of our job, right? Understanding the data first. He had that data in his back pocket. You couldn't say, oh, he's another Chicago cop. He was prepped. The other thing is understanding those misperceptions exist. But I think that is balanced. And I have done a great job of this in my career, and I've done a poor job of it. When I do a poor job of it, it's so glaring so quickly. You have to pull the stories out of the community that illustrate that data. So anytime I've written something and someone's like, something's missing, this isn't working for me. When I was conscious of it, I would realize that I had left out the personal story, the story about the community, the sense that what's actually happening needs to be reflected on the page or in the speech or in the talking point. So data, stories, taking advantage of one, I always talk about this, of the things that are already happening in our community, the newsletters that exist, the meetings that exist. Those are all opportunities to message. And then identifying the gaps, right? Where aren't we? So when I worked at Prevent Child Abuse America, the question I always tried to ask was, where aren't, oh, we're not on Twitter yet? That's next. And I will be happy to engage anyone on what's actually effective. But my approach at the time, and it was a little more, to use this phrase again, the Wild West, we didn't know what was going to work. But however people are going to find you, that's where you need to go. And so you put out a press release, you've got to put that onto your blog. Then you've got to tweet the link to that blog. Then you've got to mention in a speech that you tweeted that, so that you're constantly saturating the universe. Again, Sarah, big shout out to her. How extensive is your reach? How much dosage, right? So now I'm going to break it down. I didn't do a good job of giving you an actual formula, but I always try to encourage people, understand the science and the data in your neighborhood, understand the personal stories, understand what's our available platforms to tell those stories and promote that data, and then identify where the gaps are. Where aren't you? And then I always finish, because we tend to overlook this sometimes. What action steps are you recommending, right? What do we want people to do? Is it, hey, please call this agency in your neighborhood and offer to volunteer? Is it donate some money? Is it take this messaging and put it on your Facebook page? So then start breaking down, because people used to always say, Prevent Child Abuse America, well, what can I do? And I would say quite a bit, actually, and it doesn't have to involve a lot of work. You've got, for whatever reason, 3,000 people on your Facebook page. Don't know why. That's potentially 3,000 people who haven't seen this message, right? So let's make that happen. And then if they come back to you and say, this feels like a lot, well, cool. My friend Ben's available. You can talk to him, right? So you build and build. And does that make sense, or is that too much? Too scattered?
No, I'm tracking. And what about, so I'm just pulling you for more. Give me more. So what about the prevention professional? Maybe they lead a small prevention team or a community coalition. They work in prevention. They have passion. They care. When, where, how can they bring in some of their passion, their feelings into their communication?
Yeah, good. Right on. So I want to take a moment, and this is not an intentional plug, though it's an intentional plug. I mean, when you have an organization like the Montana Institute, which again, we're both associated with. Yeah. So I am doing some conscious marketing here, but not contracted to do it, doing it out of my love for the work. You know, there's a whole framework, the positive community norms communications framework. I just want to make sure I'm giving you highlights, things for people, building blocks, but there's a whole big way to think about this that breaks it down phase by phase, that shows you and walks you through the chronology of how to do things, how to think about fidelity. So I just want to make sure people also hear you and I talking about that. There are existing frameworks and, they kick butt and they have science behind them too, right? So you're not only highlighting science, you're putting work out there that in and of itself has evidence. So want to get that off the table. To your point about passion, the question becomes, how are you trying to communicate? What are you trying to say? Who are you trying to reach? And then what I say to people is, put your passion into that work. Sometimes I'll have an exchange with someone and they'll say, I don't think this is academic enough, or I don't think it sounds highfalutin. I'm sure no one uses that word.
I do.
Good. Well, so I believe that is not overrated. Obviously, there are times, you're turning something into a funder or the government, or I've been lucky enough to help people write testimony in front of Congress. Like, you don't mess around with that, right? You're as serious as possible. And you want to be serious because the work is serious, but you can infuse your passion in it. It's okay to say, look, man, there is nothing I care about more than the parents and children in this community, right? I mean, that's the passion, right? There's nothing I care about more than this conversation I had in 7-Eleven the other day, or Circle K, or at church, or at my mosque. Like, it changed me, and I hope I had an impact also, right? And there's the both and element that Dr. Linkenbach loves. Also, there's data to back it up, right? Like, I'm not only passionate, though I'm going to tell you what happened at the supermarket the other day. And then I'm going to remind you there's a whole study that backs it up. That's one thing. The other thing, which I didn't mention earlier purposely, so now is a good time for it. But another thing we talk about the Montana Institute quite a bit is hope and concern, right? So the positive is about the hope. The hope is things are possible. Things are working. There are numbers that show that there's a misperception, but it doesn't mean we're not concerned. We're still concerned about X or Y or Z. It's just that we're also hopeful about A and B and C. And so how do you bring your passion to it? You recognize that you're passionate about the positive, hopeful things, and you still have concerns. And you can tell, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but you can tell those stories. And I always say to people, it's cool to be unabashed about it, right? Like, for me, prevention is not everything, but in a way it is, right? If we prevent things from happening, and this is not the right word, but people love to use it. It's not as sexy as something more dramatic, right? Because you prevent something from happening, there may be no real obvious proof of it. But everything we prevent from occurring has its own ripple effect, right? And so that's what we're trying to get to, is creating, again, saturation, a swell. Like, we used to work with the Frameworks Institute, and I remember they used to say, and I love this because, again, it plays to what I'm interested in. They said, it's really amazing if one person makes a difference, and we minimize what a big deal that is. They said, however, and I want to say this to everybody listening too, however, your job is to try to impact the most people you can. So is it great if your neighbor does something important? Yes. Is it more effective if you help pass a piece of policy that elevates all the families in your neighborhood? Heck yes. So I always say to people, don't minimize that, but how big can we? What does that look like? How can we organize? Now I'm going to sound like my grandfather, right? So I'm giving you a little callback. How do we organize around that? I was lucky enough to be only tangentially involved when they passed the Affordable Care Act. Again, that could be very political. I don't mean it as political, but one of the pieces of policy that got tucked in the Affordable Care Act was funding home visiting across America to the tune of quite a bit of money, because that was an enormous piece of policy. And I remember I always thought, you want to argue about whether we should be offering health care to people, which again, this would be my one political comment. How we can argue about whether everybody should have health care is so completely beyond my capacity to understand the world. But I'm going to toss that out. If you want to argue about that, great. But if you're going to ignore that this piece of policy elevated an endless set of families with home visiting that we know prevents abuse, that we know helps with effective parenting, I don't know how to argue with you about that. I don't know. What are we arguing about? You don't want to elevate families? I mean, I understand it's political for some people, but home visiting is a proven effective tool. And we spent years at Prevent Child Abuse America and other partners trying to write policy based on science, based on effectiveness. And that got tucked into that bill. And I always thought, I'll fight with you about everything, but not that slice. Not that slice. So that's what I'm talking about.
So what I'm hearing is some passion,
Oh, dude. I mean,
some
I'm trying to
fire,
reel it in for you, but I'm not great. I didn't want to be great at that. I used to be really self-conscious about getting excited about this stuff.
Mhm,
And I'm a bit of a
mhm.
fanboy anyway. So it's like meeting you. I'm thinking Dave Closson is effing cool. I got to be friends with that guy. Or, Dr. Linkenbach or all of the colleagues, Carla and Sarah. And again, I am obviously very TMI, but or all of their guest speakers, Jason Kilmer,
Mhm.
Jason Anderson, who, if he hasn't been on your show yet, I'm not even sure you can contain him. If anyone's more positive than Jason Anderson, and we're on Jason, if you're listening, bro. But my point is, I used to be really self-conscious about being passionate about this stuff. And then, it took me till like 40 to drop that. I have to say, one of my most liberating things ever was just dropping that embarrassment.
Mhm.
This is important work. I'm honored we get to do it and talk about it. And,
Mhm.
man, everyone's life that is better, every community that is elevated, every parent who feels better equipped to do their work. And I know you've got a little one. I have a great story for you, by the way, we talked about offline, but everybody who has a better opportunity to impact someone's lives. How cool is it to be around that and part of that? I don't want to be embarrassed to be excited about that.
Right? So that is a wonderful segue to kind of my last two things that are really on
Right
my heart
on.
and mind that I'd love to chat with you about. And one might be a shorter one, so we'll go with that one first. In that earlier you brought up your why. And finding your why, knowing your why is so important to me in my own personal journey,
Yeah.
to the point where I actually did a workshop with Simon Sinek's team to find my why. And it is now on all 5 of my computer monitors. It is my wallpaper. So it reminds me every single day of why I do what I do. And that's to live and share a life of continued growth so that we may all overcome our adversities and live a fulfilling life. So living and
Hey.
sharing. That's why I do what I do. And I'm curious, what's your why? Tell us about sort of your journey to finding your why, and or how does it influence the work that you do?
So some of this will be absolutely self-serving, whereas yours was like pure and beautiful. I am not that pure and beautiful. So let's put that out there. It's interesting. There's two parts to this. I'm fascinated by people's ability to be their most effective selves. That, I mean, even
Mhm.
more than some of the other things we've talked about, that's a driving thing. I don't think I could articulate that before I lost my job and before I went on
Mhm.
my search, which wasn't much of a search. It was just shifting between this room and the front room of our tiny apartment. But, you know, as I started to think about what I wanted to do around storytelling and other things, I kept coming back to this. How are we our most effective selves? And, also how can companies be their most effective selves and communities? So it's not limited to the individual, though I do have a bit of an individual bent sometimes. And I push back on it, right? Because again, that big policy question. So that's part of it. And that became pretty clear pretty quickly, but that applies to lots of things I do. The profound thing, but again, profound to me because it affected me. It doesn't affect anyone else. So again, it's self-serving. But I had done communications. I had done tons of workshops and trainings and keynotes. And again, I know there's a lot of ego involved in that. So I don't want to minimize my extrovertedness and my desire to get love from tons of people. Like it's a terrible, terrible trait. However, when you get to do that on behalf of prevention work, when you get to talk about policy and elevating lives, at least it's self-serving for a good reason, I hope. Which again, core principle 7, be passionate. It's only as important from the Montana Institute and the Science of Positive. It's only as important as your ability to implement that in service, right? And so that's what makes me feel slightly better about my ego. But what I want to stress is I had really moved away from the training workshop piece. I was very caught up in a lot of what you and I have been talking about, which is how to bend the internet to our will, how to communicate better. And I think I started believing that I was like a top-notch marketing guy or wanted to be, and,
Mhm.
was really able to do a lot of good work. But after I lost my job, I remember being very focused on the next cool marketing jobs, and I found some, and I was not that great at them. And I really want to stress that. One thing I've always been very comfortable with is my own failure. And the why that hit me was on the right team with the right data, I can be a marketing whiz. But day to day, what do I want to be? I want to be someone moderating meetings and facilitating things and going out and building workshops and talking to people about storytelling and If I had known that, I probably still would have gotten fired, but I wouldn't have been quite so lost in the valley or whatever the right metaphor is afterwards. So I think my why is very much focused around how do we get people to be the most effective advocates for themselves, for their work, for the families they work with, and how do I get to connect with people? Yes, Twitter and Facebook and those things are really cool. I don't think I'm as good at that as designing a workshop where we get a bunch of people in a room for 90 minutes or half a day or a full day and really break down what the science and frameworks are that will serve them. And how do you translate that? So that's why, again, not super sexy. That's what hit me. How do you do that all the time? And so that's what I've been trying to do the last 4 or 5, 6 years. And it's been really, really interesting.
I dig it. And just another reason we jive so well in that when I try to articulate what DJC Solutions does, really it's all geared towards helping individuals and organizations reach their next level of excellence. Because y'all out there are already doing amazing work. Like, I'm not here to tell you how to do your job. I just want to help you reach that next level. And
Yes.
I do that through a lot of different ways, whether it be podcasting, training, facilitation, my book, speaking. Those are just ways, tools, processes, all geared towards helping y'all bring your A game, be your best.
Dude. And that ties into, you're doing a callback within our callback, right? Because that's what I always tried to say to people about good storytelling. We're not suggesting you need to do better work. Maybe you do. Maybe, I don't know. But what we're suggesting is, what's the story you're telling that brings the most people to you so you can be the best version of yourself? So yeah, that's why we jive. We believe that.
Yeah. Yes.
We believe that.
Yes. And last little topical area actually dovetails nicely, and it's about identity. And I'm selfishly asking it because of my own personal journey, crafting my identity to really work in alignment with my passion and my quote job, because under your email signature, and I've got to look at it because I can't remember it all. We'll call it tired dad brain.
Been there.
You're a teacher, storyteller, a coach, a podcaster. You're a principal at Hef Creative Strategies, lover of all things books, run, and street art. You're a father. You're a trainer for the Montana, like so many, quote, different things, but you're able to be you, live authentic, and find ways to live authentic through all those different means. How? Unpack. Ready, go.
So first off, let's acknowledge, I hope that's accurate. Not the signature line, but your belief in my authenticity. You know, one thing I focus on quite a bit, this sounds something, I don't know what the word is, like, stripping away my desire to embellish the truth, to be something I'm not, to sound better, to pretend I don't fail. So a lot of it has just been trying to get in tune with who I am. Acknowledge as well that I'm super privileged. It seems important to be honest about that. Here I'm born male and white and Gen X and straight, which automatically means there's a lot of things I'm not going to run into, and to not sort of know that all the time and to try to be, what's the word to that? To honor it, certainly. So all of that is part of it. It's balanced by me. As I said, though, this is actually more important in the context of what you're saying. I'm very fanboy. I'm very passionate. There's a reason I do a lot of things, because there really are a lot of things that excite me. They tend to come back to storytelling. They tend to come back to how do people get to be the best versions of themselves. But I really want that. It's funny. People always talk about, oh my God, we got to talk about work and politics. Let's not, that's the third rail, but I want to talk about work and politics. Like, I want to understand the journey you're on. Like you said, you're JOB, but I always say to people, if you're excited about your work, let's spend less time creating a delineation between work and your personal life. So one thing I've done is allowed all of that to collapse, and that's helped a lot. I used to pretend I wasn't a writer at work because I didn't want people to be distracted. I used to pretend I wasn't so excited about stuff. And I thought, what's the difference? And if someone finds it funny or hopefully not offensive, but if they're embarrassed for me, let them be embarrassed for me. I used to be very self-conscious, and I want to draw this delineation because I think it's actually one of the most important parts of what you're asking. I was never uncomfortable with failing. I never thought of that as a big deal. Just you fail, things go wrong, it's bad timing, you made a mistake. I could live with that, even though I'm quasi-perfectionist. But I was very uncomfortable talking about it. I wasn't uncomfortable living it. It's like, cool, on to the next thing. Or they're wrong, right? They're wrong. I'll show them. And I'm very petty. And that has, so both my most authentic and least authentic qualities, I'm super effing petty. I know that. So I really never let go of grudges. And I use it to drive my work. But I think what's important is I have a friend who's an entrepreneur, and I invited him to speak in a class of mine. This is like 10 years ago. This was transformative for me. And someone said, so like, are you really successful? And he was like, and he is. He said, I'm running something now that's really working well. He said, that ignores the fact that my first effort to start a business failed horribly. It ignores the fact that my second business, my partner stole all the money, and I wasn't even paying enough attention to see it coming. I was so focused on the work. So yes, right now I'm doing a thing. And when I tell you, Dave, he was so relaxed and comfortable with his like unbelievable failures. I thought, you mean me. I need to do a better job of that. It's okay. People fire you. You don't understand why. You pitch a project, you get rejected. You pitch a book, I'm an author. People say no. The other day, someone was like, I have this book out now. Sorry, very self-serving. It's doing well enough. And someone said, man, you're on such a good run. I said, I really am, after 7 years of only rejections. So yes, I'm trying to enjoy it now. And I'm trying to build, this is the last piece of this because I won't bore you with this answer. I think the next thing I'm going to say is really important. I've really forced myself to find more equanimity with the bad days and the bad moments and when I'm upset and when I'm angry. And so embrace that whole range of emotions. That's another thing I wasn't great at when I was young. My thinking was the healthiest you can be, and here I'm a child of a therapist, is to feel nothing. And in my middle age, I allow myself to feel everything. Then I say, okay, sit with it, get rebalanced, get the F back to work. So that may be the last piece, which is find equanimity however you can do that. And, man, that is something I'll probably be spending the rest of my days on, but it has made my life much better.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And my spin on my own journey really, so I don't know if you want to call it a fail or not, but folks are like, oh, Dave, business is great. That's awesome. You really launched this sucker. Y'all don't realize I started my business in 2015 and I didn't start working for myself until this is my third year now, and it's 2024. So it's taken me a little while to get to that point. But no, identity and doing all the things that excite you. Part one, I realized the importance of identity in my own addiction, and that it became I was Party Dave. Drunk Dave, that was my identity. And it was so hard to break free from that identity. And then sort of the next little light bulb was when I was a cop, in that being a college cop in a small rural Illinois college town, population 20,000, I was always a cop, on duty, off duty. Mm-hmm. That became my identity. And I didn't like being defined by my job title. And so I finally switched, and I'm trying to build a career that will give me the kind of life and allow me to be the kind of man I want to be. So that's why I'm building my business, is for that. The business is just the vehicle and the means for me to be who I want to be and live how I want to live. But I struggled though with, I want a podcast. I liked writing the book. I want to be a speaker. I want to be a trainer. I like building, I like doing all these, what feel like separate, different things. And so really working with how can I align them to that bigger purpose, and then going about doing it. And then the last little bit about identity too, early on, I had the imposter syndrome. I felt like I had to dress a certain way to be respected, but I'm not a shirt and collar guy. And I'm finally to the point where I want to be known as, I'm just Dave, man. That's why I wear the t-shirts now.
That's awesome. So let me challenge you on something because this isn't
Yeah.
about you, though it's about you.
Oh, yeah.
You know, two things I've tried to embrace, which are completely aligned, again, with what you're talking about, is that I don't ask myself, I've stopped asking myself, how do these things connect? They just connect because they're things I'm excited about. Like I don't spend any time anymore worrying about what does the podcast mean to a consulting gig, next novel I'm working on. And I've just accepted this is how I'm trying to live every day. And they're connected enough. I am, in this case, the mothership. And so I don't know if it's going to help you, but it has helped me.
Yeah.
I don't sweat any of it. If I'm interested in it, it serves a purpose. I can figure that. I mean, I could connect it for you. I love connecting things. So it may also help you just to let go of that. Like to me, I'm not talking about you. Trust me. It's a false dichotomy or it's a false whatever. It's who you are. Dave Closson wants to write a book, do a podcast, and make money. Awesome. The other thing, and I always say this, I think people don't believe me or I sound like a jerk off. Either one is fine. You know, I want to make as much money as possible. Of course, most of us do. I've never been great at it. I'm very comfortable with that. But what I will say, I will do things that don't make money if they excite me. So the other sort of factor in this is I do measure, does that excite me? Does it make me happy? And so I don't think my podcast is ever going to make any money, though it has opened doors to other work opportunities that have made money. But, you know, I get to talk and meet, and you will be a future guest, incredible people. And I get to capture that and I get to put it out in the world and have that conversation. What do I care if that makes me any money? I mean, I've let go of that. I used to be more caught up in. That's another thing. So a lot of it, maybe it's middle age. It's just sloughing stuff off. If it's cool, I'm going to do it. That's it. I'm going to do it. And we'll see how that shakes out. And if it becomes less cool, I'll drop it. And so that's the other thing, right? You start dropping things along the way. So if that helps you, I've stopped worrying about how things are connected. I've just worried about, do I want it? How am I going to make it happen? Let's pursue that. And you know, we'll find out later. And that's, you know, been very helpful for me. That has served me well. I don't question anything anymore.
I'm going to pull that clip out and send that to a few folks. I already know.
And they're going to be like, who is this dude? He's horrible. Hate him. I really hate that guy. Great. You know,
fun fact. Every December for the last 3 years, I do an end of year report for my business. I'm a team of one, well, growing now, but I've been a team of one. I would write a 13-page document just for myself. But within that document, this is what you might really find interesting, is that I would do a time analysis. Just where did I spend most of my time this last year? Then I just made this up, but a happiness versus headaches analysis, where as I just look back on the year, don't have to go through the calendar, just think about, 2023, what were some high points? What were some happy moments? List those out. What were some headaches? Boom, list those out. All right, great. Compare that to the time analysis. That gives me some focus for action. How can I have less headaches and increase the happiness?
Dude,
it's fun.
I
it's
love
easy.
that.
It's simple.
I do an end of the year thing, not as serious as yours. I might have to change my thing, but you know, we were talking earlier about the science of the positive and the cycle transformation. The last step is return or reflect.
Yeah.
I reflect at the end of every year and I try to identify the things I didn't enjoy. I don't always call them headaches, but I think about, did I enjoy that? Do I have to keep doing that? And that's the question I ask. Do I have to keep doing that? You know, it is accurate and obnoxious that I mostly only do things I enjoy. That is accurate. Now, that also means I'm not necessarily making as much money as I could and a million other things, but I have cut out a lot of that stuff. And I've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I've done stuff even in the last 2, 3, 4 years where I took a gig I should have taken, or I mismanaged a gig that needed to end or continue differently. So I'm not above the mistake part, but I'm also very conscious of trying to think, is this working? Am I happy? What does that look like? And, you know, you and I both have the benefit that most of what we do does benefit other people, helps them hopefully be more effective, helps them be more self-aware. So that's also, I mean, very cool. And, you know, it's humbling. I think you know, a lot of days it's very humbling and it's awesome to be humbled all the time.
Just focus on putting value into this world. What value can I bring to you, to this world? Absolutely. And I'll use that as a segue to kind of close things out. You put a lot of value out into the world. You have your books, which I want you to tell me about, your podcast, which I want you to tell me about, and the work you do with Heft Creative Strategies as well. How can folks connect with you and possibly even work with you?
They're very generous, sir. So it always helps to go to the main website, tanzerben.com. I always encourage people, build a mothership of your own. I've used that phrase twice, but build a place where everybody can find who you are, what you care about. Take time to write out what's meaningful to you, how you go about your business. Make sure the links are in place. So you can always, if you get there, you'll figure everything out. You'll probably decide you don't want to meet me, but at least you'll have confirmation of that. It won't just be a bias. Yeah. The podcast is just podcast will change your life. I named it that because early on I thought, oh my God, it's so embarrassing to think you have something put out in the world. I'm happy to say that was 15 years ago and we are 350 episodes in. I primarily talk to writers, but I definitely also talk to podcasters. You will be one of those, or you're also a writer. But I'm interested in change makers in general. Like if someone tells stories in an interesting way, then they should come on and I want them. So they're not always published authors. Maybe they're photographers or they run an eco-conscious hedge fund. They're trying to tell the story of something that betters people's lives, this world. So I will always make wiggle room for that. I am also an author, which is endlessly awesome and endlessly humbling. I always tell the story. This has now happened twice, but this is in my entire adult life where someone recognized me and asked me if I was Ben Tanzer, the author. That's only happened twice though, both times in Chicago.
That is cool.
That's twice in 20 years. But the first time it happened, I was out with my older son, who at the time was like 10 years old. And someone stopped me on the street and said, "Hey, are you Ben Tanzer, the author?" And then my son leaned in and said, he is, but he is not successful. So I have held on to that story. I think that's very helpful. I do currently have a novel out, The Missing, with 713 Books, which is a publisher based out of New York and LA. That book had a long growth and gestation period, but it's been out in the world since March and it's been great. I mean, the ego part for sure is that I had a sort of 7-year break between this book and the last one. I taught myself to be more patient and be way cooler than I used to be. And I'll admit, it's not going to be a bestseller. It's gotten a lot of attention and I forgot how enjoyable that is, like to talk about your book and to be out in the world. And like this weekend, I get the honor of speaking at the Printers Row Lit Fest here in Chicago. I'm going to be on a panel talking about writing about family. So, it's interesting, like with the books bring all this other stuff, chances to speak, chances to be on other people's podcasts. And I'm thrilled that books come out more formally soon enough. I know my next book will have a publishing date. So after a 7-year break, I will have books come out in consecutive years. So that is bragging. I'm very excited. This book is either really, really, really interesting and fun or a total trash fire. It is not clear to me. My editor said it is not a trash fire, but I don't believe him yet. People can find the podcast, like your podcast. My podcast is everywhere. Anywhere people want to go get podcasts, please listen. Heft Creative Strategies is really just a way to capture sort of my non-TMI work, my non-teaching work. I do a lot of coaching, which is a thrill. People bring me in to design workshops for them. I must admit, I've been doing a little less of that because Montana Institute's been growing. I am benefiting from that. But, if there's a Heft Creative Strategies thing you want, I also help authors. Sometimes people have a manuscript and they just don't think it's there yet and they don't know why. I get a lot of those and I'm thrilled. They send me their book. We work something out. So a lot of literary stuff out of that shop, a lot of coaching, a lot of designing workshops, and a lot of times, again, bro, through that thread of storytelling. What story are you trying to tell? What help do you, I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but all findable. I appreciate you asking. I'm thrilled to be here. This has been a blast.
Absolutely. Links galore in the show notes and coming back actually earlier to the Montana Institute. I'll have a link to their website, but they also have a free online course talking about science of the positive
Good.
So I'll link to that as well.
I know you and I can both sound like cheerleaders and I'm happy to, but I also think, and I really believe, because this has been some part of my life for the last 10, 15 years, Montana Institute really does great work. And they, one thing they do, and this was an early lesson. I hoped I was always like this, and I'm going to completely garble all this, but it also speaks to the work I try to do. And I think you try to do, which is, it's not, no one's showing up, at least with the people we work with, telling you what's what. People are invited in and they say, how can we support you? What do you need? How do you get to the next phase? That's a lot different. There's an old story that Jeff has told, which I always garble, right? Where someone connects with this Aboriginal group, I think in Australia, and they say, hey, we're here to help. And the Aboriginal leader's like, if you're here to support us, awesome. If you're here to tell us what to do, see ya. That is not the intellectual version of that story. But, that's the other thing I love about the Montana Institute. How can we help you? We have some ideas. Let's sit down and figure it out. That's everything to me.
Yep. Y'all believe what I believe, and that prevention is better together.
Come on.
So much so, it's on a shirt.
Yes, it is, because you're a t-shirt guy. You are not a shirt and tie guy.
That is right. But all right, more to come.
Always
Listeners,
more to come.
Thanks for tuning in. Check out the show notes for the links and pass this episode along to a friend.
Please.
Till our next conversation, Mr. Ben Tanzer. I will see you soon.
Appreciate you, brother.
Absolutely. Together's better. Appreciate you.
Right on.
Thank you for listening to the Prevention Leaders Podcast with Dave Closson. Since prevention is better together, make sure you click the subscribe button and share this and other episodes with a friend. If you have a topic idea or guest suggestion, follow us on social media or email us at info@preventionleaders.com.